Welcome to Fahrenheit 140.
Why 140? It's the temperature that water burns after 6 seconds. I'm Robert Mace.
And I'm Carrie Thompson, and we're the Fahrenheit 140 co-hosts covering the news you need to know about climate change in Texas. Welcome to the podcast. Robert and I are going to talk about what's been going on in Texas and climate. Then we're going to get to talk to a pretty special guest. We've got Doug Melnick joining us today from the city of San Antonio.
Neat.
They are doing some incredibly innovative and proactive work on all fronts in climate.
Wonderful.
Resilience, preparedness, mitigation, adaptation. They're one of the big winners from recent infrastructure funding from the federal government.
Nice.
And so we've got a lot of big projects, very ambitious projects getting off the ground. So we'll get to talk to him and hear a little bit more about the Climate Ready Action Plan, which is really kind of setting the tone for other cities across the country.
Good.
And,
yeah, they're always a leader in things. So certainly appreciate that about them.
The citizens there are really knowledgeable, very proactive, and just doing a great job managing their resources.
Yeah, you got to love a city that on the front page of the newspaper, they have a water level in the well.
Right. And the weather reports talk about the aquifer level as well. It's just like a dream.
It's cool.
So they're trying to think about how do they do that for climate awareness too. And the excitement ahead is our season finale, which is next month. We'll be wrapping up the season.
And then it looks like you have a special guest with you here today.
Oh, I do. My sidekick Ruby's here.
Ruby, little pooch. Yeah. Unfortunately, Ruby's already fallen asleep.
Like I said, look forward to the season finale. We'll be reaching out to you on our website and our social media to tell you more. But why don't we dive in? I'd love to hear what you found in the news this month.
Sure. So I'm cheating a little bit, but we have here at the Meadow Center a blog called Hotter Than a Habanero, and it's mostly focused on climate. And I recently made a post titled Forecasting the Unpredictable: Water Planning Under Deep Uncertainty. Kind of captures my thoughts on water planning in general and how do you plan for climate change. Mm-hmm. I call it Forecasting the Unpredictable because reality is we don't really know what's going to happen. We know it's probably going to get worse. Question is how much worse is it going to get? And a lot of that hinges on kind of unknown feedback triggers that we might cross that suddenly throws us into really dire water resource situations.
Like domino effect.
Yeah, domino effect. And then there's cascading triggers where you trigger one trigger, which then triggers another trigger, and you get several. And that makes it very difficult to even quantify what you're planning for. With the period of record that we plan for today, you can calculate what those statistics are and go, well, this is what this event looks like. Maybe it's a 1 in every 100 year. You use tree ring data to kind of extend the record out a bit. But with planning for climate change, you can't really quantify what that is. You can probably look at the actual record and go, well, it's something worse than a 1% chance of happening, but we don't know exactly what it is. And it's also interesting too that when people plan for a really serious event, they wind up convincing themselves that they're good to go. And the reality is, as we know with planning in Texas, you can always have a drought worse than the drought of record. We saw that in Austin. We saw that with Lake Meredith, north of Amarillo. You can always have a drought worse than the drought of record. And it's the same thing with whatever scenario we plan for, unless you have a water supply that in and of itself is 100% reliable. And even those don't really exist. Probably the closest we come to 100% reliability is seawater desalination. Takes a hell of a lot to drain the Gulf of Mexico, but the power grid that's used to support that supply might not be as resilient. Maybe the pipeline moving the water might not be as resilient. So there may be other things affecting that resilience. So I got interviewed by one of the TV stations in Austin, and they asked me the question: is Austin at risk of running out of water? And the answer is yes. And actually, under any circumstance, the answer is yes, because there can always be something that happens. With Austin's planning for climate change, the odds of Austin running out of water are small, but it's still a risk. And so,
well, it actually ties really well in with the article I brought,
sweet.
Which I think is sort of referencing a very prominent scientist that might be on this podcast with me right now.
Awesome.
A double dip of Robert Mays today. So this one was Wall Street Journal. Actually, they did a podcast, and the title of the podcast is Hot, Dry, and Booming, a Texas Climate Case Study.
I didn't know they did a podcast.
Yeah. Interestingly, kind of centered on Kyle, the city of Kyle. The podcast kind of starts talking to someone who moved to Kyle recently. Those of us who've been in Texas for a while, we've seen a lot of people moving here from other places, and we watched them have that first summer.
Right.
And all the dreams kind of melt from their face. And so it does talk to someone who moved here and just the harsh reality of our heat. Not only our heat, but our humidity, because there's such a construction boom. There's a lot of folks that are working outside, and they kind of dive into someone's experience of the shock of that, of what it's actually like to live here right now. I mentioned last year the heat index reached about 118, and this June it was 115. And so they talk about the city of Kyle getting hotter and hotter, but also growing at this insane rate, and then also running out of water.
Yeah, they've had to buy unused Edwards Aquifer permitted use from San Marcos to meet their needs.
At the last minute, right?
Yeah,
Just sort of like they literally were out.
And I think that's happened at least over the last 2 years.
It's the country's second fastest growing city of cities that have more than 500,000 people. It's about 20 miles from Austin, for those of you that don't know. Today's population is about 70,000, which is double what it was 10 years ago. So it's doubled in 10 years. Then they go on to talk about how that's just kind of happening all over Texas. And between 2010 and 2022, the state's population jumped 20% to over 30 million people. People are moving here even though they're aware of the climate conditions, but they disregard that because they're able to get a quality of life that they can't get elsewhere. We were just talking to our producer, Sarah, about housing costs and the reality of people buying a home, and that's still possible in places like Kyle. So the fact that it's enduring drought and running out of water takes a back seat, but then also kind of tends to hit people in the face once they encounter the reality of what that means here. They just signed a contract to build a new pipeline, bringing water from the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer. I mean, that's a huge expense, but it should keep them water secure for about 50 years. Just to your point of what you were just saying, that prediction's based on models that are using old data of how, they're not factoring in the fact that a lot of other cities are also pumping from the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer or planning to bring water from there. So
I know the article that the Wall Street Journal published has me not directly quoted, but summarized that I said the Carrizo-Wilcox was going to go dry, which is not what I said. What I said was that all the pumping that's going to happen is going to interfere with each other and affect the ability to produce water. The aquifer won't go dry. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's highly unlikely that it would go dry. And that ties back to, you can look at the way the aquifer is currently managed, which does appear you could produce over the next 50 years. But the issue is really kind of groundwater law, what powers groundwater districts have. And a common perception that groundwater districts can't tell anybody no. And so when you look at what's happening with groundwater, it looks like we're fine for the next 50 years. That's great. But if the districts keep changing the goalposts and allow more and more pumping, I'm not convinced.
Right.
We're first going to see issues, I think, north of the Colorado River. So San Antonio does some big pumping up there. We're seeing a lot of growth up there. We're seeing fab plants, data centers, things of that ilk going in, and also other communities on the north side of Austin seeking to bring water in from the Carrizo. And so it has me concerned that the water that people think is there is actually not going to be there, and they're going to be surprised. And I think that's probably going to happen in 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, the quote here is that based on my conversation with some really knowledgeable academics, it might only be 10 or 20 years.
Oh, I'm not sure that's me.
It sounds like it. It lines up.
Yeah, well, I didn't say 10 to 20 years. So.
No, but they go on to talk about the reality of desalination and how that's going to be critical to our future, and then Purple Pipeline.
Direct potable reuse.
So they're just highlighting, we're in a race to see what happens with growth versus adaptation to climate change. And they're highlighting Kyle, Texas as a bellwether for how well we're going to do this across the country, and then saying it's a poster child for some of these challenges.
Yeah. And just up the road from Kyle, Buda is looking at direct potable reuse, which is rather amazing. That is a strong indication of how rare water is in this part of the state and these communities struggling with meeting water supplies.
We always knew water is scarce, and at some point we'd run into this, but that speed is changing because of climate change and because of this migration that's happening.
On the good side, there'll be more friends for Ruby to play with at the dog park.
You have to pay every time you say her name, so just...
And then I'll have Sarah post a link to more of a private blog I have that talks about the Carrizo-Wilcox.
One of the things for listeners to keep in mind is sort of that critical thinking that both of these articles reference is remember that models are based on past realities, and we can see that our realities are changing very rapidly. So never assume that those models are speaking to the future perfectly, right?
Right.
And that's true for flooding and all sorts of things. So, well, I guess it'd be fun to go talk to our guest.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Doug Melnick is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of San Antonio. He holds a Bachelor in English and graduate degrees in both urban planning and environmental studies. He comes by way of Albany, New York, where he served both as the Director of Planning and the Director of the Mayor's Office of Energy and Sustainability. He came to Texas about 10 years ago to be appointed as San Antonio's very first Chief of Sustainability, and has really pioneered and pushed one of the most ambitious climate programs that we've seen across the country. I'm so happy to share that we have Doug Melnick from the City of San Antonio joining us today. Doug is the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of San Antonio. San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the country, second largest in the South, second largest in Texas also.
Yeah. San Antonio is really a really interesting community in terms of change and progress. And so I think it's the people of San Antonio are well aware of climate change and the need for resilience. How you get there, though, is always an ongoing discussion.
Which is really what brings us together today. So we want to talk to you about the San Antonio Climate Ready Action Plan. Your goal is to make the city carbon neutral by the year 2050.
That plan was adopted by City Council back in 2019. We're currently just starting to update that plan this year. And at the time, carbon neutrality by 2050 was the best practice. That's what science was telling us. Things are different now. Climate science is letting us know that we need to do more faster. So our target may be adjusted, but back in 2019, carbon neutral by 2050, that was the goalpost.
Which is pretty ambitious for a city that
even that is incredibly ambitious.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit more about what does it mean to be climate ready, and what is the action plan aiming to do besides address carbon?
Yeah, the SA Climate Ready Plan that was adopted by Council has two components. Climate action, it has sort of two sides to it. One is the mitigation side. We need to reduce emissions, anthropogenic, man-made emissions that are resulting from powering our communities, the energy in our buildings, transportation sector, emissions that are coming out from the landfill, from whatever we're throwing out there. So how do we reduce our contributions to global climate change? And then the second part is adaptation. How do we make sure that our community residents, infrastructure systems are prepared for climate change? And when I first started doing this work years ago, climate change was always decades away. It was something that we didn't really, or we hoped for the best. As we all know now, it is here now, and it's accelerating. So the plan really forces us to walk and chew gum at the same time. Not only do we need to reduce emissions, but we have to completely transform our community in the face of climate change.
Looking at your plan and at the communications you're doing with the city's residents, you're talking about emergency preparedness. You're talking about the choices that folks are making in their homes. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're taking a different approach to defining these challenges?
One of the challenges that climate professionals, whether it's in local government or private sector, is climate change is such a big issue. It is something that people have difficulty processing. We're talking about, a system that is based upon burning fossil fuels, and what we've learned and what we've known for decades and decades is that has a negative impact. And so when you start trying to have conversations with people in the community, how you discuss it is important. It's one of the frustrations that we face because, it's not enough to say the scientific community is saying that this is what's happening and why, and we need to change. A lot of the pushback that we got when we developed the plan was not necessarily based in reality. Our plan was being, labeled as the city's going to force you to give up your car. Well, that's not the case. We want to shift our community to cleaner transportation choices, but the city's not coming after your car. So I think, a lot of the messaging has to be very targeted to what is important to different sectors. The message to the business community is going to be different from that to a resident of a low income neighborhood. But I think at the end of the day, it's really about stressing the opportunity and benefit of climate action. One of the things that we always say is a future of fewer automobiles, more people walking, more people biking, better mass transit, cleaner air, more parks and recreational opportunities, cooler neighborhoods, all these things that we need to do in order to reduce the impacts of climate change and to prepare for it are good things to do in and of themselves. They're things that we would want for our community. They also happen to help us on our climate journey. So we try to frame it in opportunity, positive benefit, and the economic opportunities associated with this work.
I'm wondering, as you encounter the skepticism and some of the pushback initially, are you hearing from certain communities more than others? Do you feel like certain communities within the city are more vulnerable than others?
Well, the one thing we know clearly, and we've done the research, and it's, I think, consistent across communities across the country, is we know those that contribute least to the impacts of climate change are experiencing the impacts the worst. And so we call those the frontline communities. They tend to be communities of color, those that have experienced generational disinvestment and racism. And so what we try to do in our work is really center equity in our actions. And so one of the big priorities that we are working on right now is in the area of extreme heat. We know the heat that we are experiencing, not just in San Antonio, but across the globe, is being driven by climate change. We know that our low-income residents, our communities of color, are experiencing heat differently than our more affluent neighborhoods. We have residents who don't have air conditioning. We've got residents who live in housing that doesn't have insulation. Those are the folks that are most vulnerable to climate change. And so when we look at the resources that we have, we want to prioritize those neighborhoods first. So, for instance, we are launching a cool neighborhood program, which the goal is basically mapping the city, seeing where the hottest parts of the city are, filtering it with race and income. And clearly we see very specific parts of the city are our priorities. And the goal is to get resources to those neighborhoods first. Trees, incentives for weatherization, reflective roofs, green infrastructure to help control stormwater and mitigate heat. It's all about targeting resources where they need to go first. And so when we talk about climate action, for years, we looked to cities like Portland or Vancouver, British Columbia, and they were always held up as, the leaders in climate action. But when you started looking at equity and affordability, you realize that they had a long way to go as well. So I think what we're trying to do, like many other cities, is really take care of those that need it most instead of prioritizing them later on.
Our last guest on the podcast talked a lot about the trade-offs with watering for heat island effect versus conserving water. And I know San Antonio is a leader in water conservation. Can you talk a little bit about how you've had to dance on that line?
So we're very lucky to have our municipal utility, San Antonio Water System, is a international leader. When I got to San Antonio 10 years ago, the first thing that became very clear to me was just how water literate San Antonio was. People get it. In talking to folks over at San Antonio water system, it took decades. This is something that just doesn't happen overnight. The challenge that even though there is so much water literacy, I think a lot of conversation that's going on locally is around who's using the most water, how much are they paying for it, and are there any penalties? The majority of residents hardly use any water. What we're seeing is there's just a very small number of properties, whether they're commercial, industrial, or residential in affluent parts of the city that are really using a ton of water. And so there's a lot of discussion going on right now with the utility around, how do you make sure that a small group who's using an inordinate amount of water isn't ruining it for everybody else or is paying their fair share. What's really interesting is the Texas climatologist basically stating that we don't have the water that we need in the state based upon climate projections. So the city's water use has continued to go down. But I think, again, in the face of climate change, we really have to have an honest discussion of water and what the future holds. You mentioned that balance. We're experiencing incredible growth, right? So at some point, we really need to think about, is this growth going to be sustainable based upon what the future holds?
We love to share the story of San Antonio and how the weather reports include the status of the aquifer and that people are very educated and they really understand where their water's from.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I noticed that education's a part of your program on climate as well. Are you seeing people pick up on climate literacy? Is that something that you're noticing it's 5 years since your first plan came out?
San Antonio is enormous. We're over 500 square miles. If we were to pick random people off the street and say, hey, are you aware of the SA Climate Ready plan? Probably not, just because when you think about major campaigns, you're talking enormous budgets. And so we leverage what we have. We've been doing a lot of work over the past few years, working with community-based organizations and trusted messengers to get the word out through very specific channels. But I do think our community is literate around the threats and impacts of climate change. Yale has a climate communications program, and they do annual surveys at the county level across the country where they ask a whole series of climate awareness questions. And Bexar County always scores very high in climate literacy, just like Austin. Upwards of 85% of residents are aware that climate change is occurring. They're concerned about it. We surveyed about 1,300 residents this past summer around extreme heat, and the vast majority are concerned, have seen a change over time. Only 2% said that they weren't concerned. People get it. People are concerned and people want to see action. I don't think it gets enough discussion because people are dealing with their own daily issues, right? Housing affordability, transportation, educational cost. I think that's the challenge with climate change is it's such an enormous threat, but people are trying to live their own lives. We know climate change is going to exacerbate everything. It's going to exacerbate crime. It's going to exacerbate housing costs. It's going to exacerbate energy costs. But how do we have those frank conversations when people are just still struggling on a daily basis? So it's a really interesting field to be in at this point.
When you think about how it's gone so far, what do you think some of the highlights are? What have been some of your big wins?
There's been a lot. When I first started here, I don't believe the city of San Antonio had one electric vehicle. We're up to about 120 in our fleet. And then by the end of this next year, we'll have 200 and charging infrastructure. We just commissioned 6 of 42 on-site solar installations. That's part of a solar project for the city organization that in about 2 more years, we'll have about 18% of our emissions as a municipal organization reduced because of these solar panels. We have done a tremendous amount of work in the field of resilience, developing publicly facing resilience hubs that people can go to during periods of need. We launched a really innovative program called the Climate Ready Neighborhoods Network, in which we're working with community-based and faith-based organizations, capacity building, again, from that resilience perspective. How can these organizations and these brick and mortar sites provide daily support to their community from a resilience perspective, but also provide support again during emergencies and following emergencies. So those are just a few. The challenge that we face is when you look at the scale, getting back to that, that carbon neutrality target, that's a big goal. And so we look to organizations like our municipally owned utility, CPS Energy, who is committed to get off coal in the next few years. Our transit provider, VIA, is going to be launching an advanced rapid transit system in the next year or two. So I think it gets back to that, the idea of that community awareness and educational approach, that this isn't something the city can do, but this is something that everyone in this community needs to prioritize in order to get the impact that we need. So a lot of really good things are going on, but I think we're still scratching the surface as far as where we need to be.
It's incredible, especially in the ocean of a state where climate change is often not even spoken of. I'm kind of in awe of what you've accomplished, and I wonder what advice you would give to other communities within Texas.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so we know Austin's been leading for many, many years. Dallas, Houston, Harris County, Denton. I mean, so I think there's more action than I think people would probably be aware of. To your point, it definitely gets drowned out. Again, it's not just local governments. I mean, it's institutions, it's industry and businesses. The first step is acknowledgement that climate change is real and that we have to do something. And I think regardless of what sector you're in, you are going to experience impacts if we do nothing. Following Winter Storm Uri, I remember talking with some businesses about their experience and how did that go? And of course, there were disruptions in supply chains. They couldn't get their employees to work in a timely manner. Everyone's got to acknowledge that there's a role for them. And then I think it's figuring out what's your plan. How can you reduce your emissions? How can you prepare your business or your organization or your constituents for these big impacts? And then I think finally, the third thing is probably the most important one is being creative, being flexible, and don't get discouraged. This work can be slow, but you can't give up. Giving up isn't an option, and it's continuing sort of pushing that boulder forward. And then really the last thing is, particularly now with this current administration, and we'll see what happens after November, unprecedented funding for climate work. The solar project that I had mentioned is taking advantage of some federal tax incentives, which basically means for every dollar we spend on a solar project, we get 40 cents back. The economics work. And so I would definitely stress that whether we're talking about institutions or governments, take a look at those federal incentives that are in place now. They're supposed to be around for another 4 years. If you believe in a good return on your investment and the economics of saving money for your shareholders or your constituents, just from a business perspective, climate action makes financial sense. If you start from that place, you can see that return on investment that could at least get you moving in the right direction.
And like you said earlier, a lot of these climate actions are quality of life actions that you want to make anyway. So
correct. And that's the big thing, when you talk about, just something as simple as air quality and the financial burden placed on society for those health impacts. If we clean the energy supply, if you improve the efficiency of your buildings or your fleet, that is going to result in improved air quality. That is going to reduce the burden on our community, as well as medical costs associated with treating those health ailments. So it's all connected at the end of the day. I think one of the things that we just struggle with is the politics. I think we've lost sight of science and allowing that to really sort of drive climate action has unfortunately been very polarizing in terms of what we can and can't do, when it really should be at the end of the day a scientific, economic, and public health discussion.
Well, thank you for being brave and leading. And, from where we sit, it's fun to watch y'all just try fun things and see what's working, and appreciate everything you're doing to innovate and lead in the space.
No, and thanks so much for reaching out. We definitely have a huge amount to do, but I think we've accomplished a lot so far. And I would definitely recommend, if your listeners are interested, they can go to sasustainability.com. That is our dashboard for all things climate and sustainability in the city of San Antonio. And there's some really interesting projects going on that people might be interested in learning more about.
Look them up.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. I wish we had more time, honestly, but hopefully everyone will go to the website. We're going to include all the links to the action plan and all of the cool programs that San Antonio's pioneering. Take a look at their good work. And Robert, did you bring a good news article?
I did bring a good news article. It's kind of referring to two articles and then making a leap.
Okay, that's
of my own.
That sounds like a journey we're about to go on.
When I was at the Water Development Board, I went with Carlos Rubenstein, who was the chair at the time, and some other folks to go visit with a contingent of water folks from A&M. And it was a fact-finding mission to see what A&M was working on water resources. One of the folks that was there was a futurist. Futurist is pretty much somebody that just says crazy stuff. He asked the question about, well, what's the solution to the state's water resources? And I'm like, well, it's the Gulf of Mexico, seawater desalination that's going to save us. However, the energy costs. And the Aggie Futurist, and I forget his name, he said, well, in the future, power will be free. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what kind of crazy Aggie math is that? But I pondered it, and I was like, you know what? I think that dude's right. Now, will energy truly be free? No, there's still going to be infrastructure and all that jazz. But his point was well taken in that, with solar, it'll be plentiful to where we're not going to know what to do with it all. That brings me to a couple articles in The Economist. In June of 22, they had an issue focused on the transition to renewables. And they make a number of points that, one, that by the mid-2030s, solar will be the biggest source of electrical power by the planet. And then by the 2040s, it could be the largest source, not just of electricity, but of all energy. Current trends, the all-in cost of electricity from solar promises to be less than half as expensive as the cheapest power available today. Had some plots where it's like, it's solar is going to take over. That's the projections. And I believe it because, power, like many things, is driven by the economics. But then there's the issue of, well, the sun doesn't shine at night. That brings us to the issue from last week, from September 7th, that talked about battery storage. So if you do solar with battery storage, well, then now you can have, backup power when the sun doesn't shine or it's not shining as strongly. And they noted that similar to solar cells, decreasing in cost over time exponentially, they're also seeing a decrease in battery storage. So lithium batteries per kilowatt hour of storage has fallen in cost by about 40% between 2019 and 2023.
Wow.
They said that solar power combined with batteries is now competitive with coal-fired electricity in India and is on track to be cheaper than gas-fired power in the United States in just a few years.
Fantastic.
So that'll have a major impact because it's no longer the sun only shines during the day. That can be stored. They talk about China right now is producing enough lithium batteries to meet the entire planet's needs right now. There's pros and cons to that. The United States has some tariff protections of domestic providers of lithium batteries, but much of the rest of the world is going to be buying up this extremely inexpensive lithium batteries in combination with solar. This is good news, I think on many levels. One, like it does create a extremely cost-effective path to get away from burning fossil fuels, but then also it kind of opens up, like, what do we do with all this power? And the Economist kind of asked that question. It's like, gosh, the world needs to start thinking about what do you do when you no longer have to worry about the cost of power? And, seawater desalination comes in, but then also think about CO2 sequestration. And they use sequestration in the broadest terms of somehow, taking it out of the atmosphere in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to put it underground. And so that suddenly becomes viable. to where we can pull elevated levels of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and then maybe we fix them into like little limestone blocks that people build their houses out of in the future or something. So hopefully this will happen before I die, but Sarah, you'll be around for it. Maybe Ruby too.
I guess I got skipped over on that.
We're going down together, Carrie.
Wow. All right. Fair enough. Well, I'm glad the Aggies continue to inspire you and make you a better person. That's good news. It's good news for all of us. No, that's fascinating and encouraging.
How about you? Did you find anything uplifting?
Yeah, I mean, it's not elaborate, but I was drawn to it because of your love of acronyms. So this article is from PR Newswire, called Texas Innovates and Launches Program with 10 Groundbreaking Companies during Houston Climate Week. The acronym for this Texas innovation is CHILI. You like that?
CHILI.
Yeah. CHILI. Climate and Hydrogen Innovation and Learning Incubator Program. So the idea is that it's this investment from the private sector designed to accelerate innovation in climate technology. So, we need to get the brightest minds thinking about these innovations and what's possible for technologies, particularly related to carbon solutions, like you just mentioned, and the use of hydrogen, which is a clean energy source. So they picked out these kind of 10 smaller size, but kind of trailblazing companies to support as sort of an incubator effort to accelerate that commercialization of these technologies and create impactful solutions to decarbonize the economy. The nonprofit's called Texas Innovates. It's a nonprofit dedicated to fostering hard tech innovative ecosystems, focusing on solving significant energy challenges. Just kind of nice to know that these things are out there. That's not something I'd heard about, but more and more here, we're starting to talk about the role that industry could play and should play, and frankly is playing very quietly in the backdrop of Texas.
Right.
They are investing in solar. They are investing in these technologies because they're just good for the bottom line at this point.
I don't want people to misinterpret, say, the comments I made about solar. There's still going to be a need for fossil fuels going forward, whether it's making plastics or like jet fuel. I mean, I think it's going to be a while before we have batteries and electric airplanes. I know there's people working on that as well. Hydrogen could also be the thing, but the Hindenburg didn't end up well with hydrogen, so I don't know. I'm a little worried about that, but not that jet fuel is it.
We might have come up with some advances since Hindenburg days.
But there is a pretty strong water component to the hydrogen. And someone from the Bureau of Economic Geology working on hydrogen in Texas threw up some big numbers. And so I did the calculations, and they're projecting maybe 1.4, 1.5 million acre feet of water is needed for kind of projections on where hydrogen could go. That's a lot of water.
Yeah.
So there's a question of where that comes from. And then that acronym, CHILI.
Yeah, you like it.
The word's we call it backronyms.
Backronyms?
So
you pick the acronym first.
Yeah, so you got to pick the acronym first and then work your way back to find something that fits. So.
You want to share some of your favorites you're most proud of?
Bratwurst, which was a model. So the Blanca River Aquifer tool for water and understanding resource and sustainability trends.
Good Lord.
And then somebody said that they would, if I could add beer to the end of that, they would throw in some funding. And so then we added and for the betterment of the environment and ecological resources. So
well done.
It's probably my proudest one.
I just liked seeing Texas chili. No beans allowed.
Actually, that fits, right? No natural gas.
Oh my God. You almost made a whole
episode. I did. It's your fault. So it wouldn't have come out if you hadn't said that.
I'll do better.
All right. So to wrap up, think about how you fit into the world and the environment from a sustainability standpoint. And are there things that you could do that help make the world more sustainable place, whether it's water or using materials or using energy, even though we'll have limitless energy in the future.
Well, and two, just, in that spirit, if you do make your way over to the City of San Antonio's website, they have a little pledge that I took myself through it, and it actually did make me feel more empowered. Just the little things we can all do. So
The next episode, there's going to be a Ask Us Anything opportunity for folks to send in questions, and there'll be some information out there showing up on our newsletter, our Instagram feed, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, formerly known as Twitter. So ask questions on anything. Yeah, even Ruby. We could ask questions about Ruby. I'm sure Carrie would be happy to answer those. And then I'm particularly excited that we have some dedicated producers that help us put these episodes together. That's definitely kept us organized, elevated the equipment issues. Hopefully y'all can hear the better sound.
Great guests too,
that we're doing. Yeah, great guests. Yeah. We'll pull back the curtain so you can meet our producers. So that'll be really fun. So definitely you don't want to miss it.
Well, enjoy the false fall and the real fall, everyone. And we'll be talking to you in October.
I feel a little hungry for some barbecue, so I might go to Ruby's after this episode. Bye, y'all.
Thank you all for being with us for another climate conversation. We hope you can take this information with you into your everyday life to help spread the knowledge and understanding of climate topics and their effects.
This podcast would certainly not be what it is without listeners like you. If you're listening through Spotify, take a quick moment to help us out and engage with the quiz and poll we've attached to this episode. And be sure to check the show notes for helpful links and resources.
Thank you to our funders for the Fahrenheit 140 podcast, both the Meadows Foundation and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We'd also like to thank our communications team, Anna Huff and Sarah Wingfield.
If you'd like to learn more about the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment and how to visit our vital spring lake for a ride in a glass-bottom boat here in San Marcos, Texas, be sure to visit our website, meadowcenter.txst.edu. We have a number of climate resources there, including free lesson plans for your K-12 curricula. Sign up for our newsletters to get news, updates, and event opportunities hot off the press. I'm Robert Mace.
And I'm Carrie Thompson. Thanks for being part of the conversation.